The day I discovered my sister Victoria had been using my name to secure business loans while telling me to stay out of their business, I realized that sometimes the most powerful response isn't revenge, it's simply stepping back and watching people destroy themselves without your help. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Chen, and for 32 years I believed family meant everything. I built my life around that principle, running a successful digital marketing consultancy from my home office in Portland, while always making time for family gatherings, emergency phone calls, and whatever crisis my younger sister Victoria needed help navigating this week. Victoria was the family's golden child, 3 years younger than me, with the kind of effortless charm that made everyone instantly love her. She had this way of tilting her head when she talked, flashing that perfect smile, and making you feel like you were the most important person in the world. Our parents adored her, friends gravitated toward her. Even my own clients would ask about that sweet sister of yours whenever Victoria happened to answer my business phone. While I spent my 20s building my consulting business from scratch, working 16-hour days and turning down social invitations to focus on client deliverables, Victoria floated through life, landing opportunities that seemed to fall from the sky. She'd gotten her real estate license on a whim, and somehow became the top seller at Morrison Realty within 6 months. She drove a white BMW convertible, lived in a stunning downtown loft, and always seemed to have money for designer clothes and weekend trips to Napa Valley. I admired her success, honestly. Victoria had this natural gift for connecting with people that I envy. Where I had to work hard to build client relationships through proven results and meticulous service, Victoria could walk into a room and have 3 new friends and 2 potential business deals before the appetizers arrived. She made everything look effortless. Our relationship had always been complicated but loving. Growing up, I was the responsible older sister who helped with homework and covered for Victoria when she snuck out to party. In return, she brought excitement into my structured world, dragging me to concerts and introducing me to her endless stream of interesting friends. We balanced each other perfectly, or so I thought. The thing about Victoria was that she never directly asked for help. Instead, she had this subtle way of presenting her problems that made you want to solve them for her. She'd mention casually that her car was making weird noises, and before you knew it, you were offering to pay for the repair. She'd sigh about how expensive her rent was getting, and suddenly you were suggesting she move in with you temporarily. It never felt like manipulation because Victoria genuinely seemed grateful, and she always promised to pay you back or return the favor somehow. Over the years, I'd helped Victoria through dozens of small crises. A few $100s here and there when she was between commission checks. Co-signing her apartment lease when her credit score wasn't quite high enough. Letting her use my business address when she needed to establish residency in a particular neighborhood for work purposes. None of it seemed like a big deal because Victoria was family, and family helped each other. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I was in my home office reviewing quarterly reports for my biggest client when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about the urgency of the repeated calls made me answer. Miss Chen, this is Marcus Webb from Pacific Northwest Business Credit. I'm calling regarding your loan application status. I blinked at my computer screen, confused. I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong number. I haven't applied for any business loans. There was a pause on the other end. You are Sarah Elizabeth Chen, owner of Chen Digital Solutions, correct? Business address at 847 Pine Street. My stomach dropped. That was indeed my business name, and the address I'd let Victoria use for her real estate paperwork. Yes, that's me, but I definitely haven't applied for any loans with your company. Ma'am, according to our records, you submitted an application for a $200,000 business expansion loan 3 weeks ago. The application was approved, and the funds were dispersed yesterday. I'm calling because your first payment is due in 30 days, and we wanted to confirm your preferred payment method. The room started spinning. That's impossible. Someone has stolen my identity. I need to speak with your fraud department immediately. Marcus's voice became more serious. I understand your concern, Miss Chen. However, The application was submitted with all your correct business information, including your federal tax ID number, business registration details, and even copies of your last 2 years of tax returns. The documentation appears to be legitimate. My hands were shaking as I grabbed a pen. Can you tell me where the money was sent? The funds were wire transferred to an account at Columbia River Bank, under the business name Victoria Chen Properties. The routing information matches what was provided in your application. Victoria Chen Properties. My sister had used my business credentials to secure a loan for her own company, a company I didn't even know existed until this moment. After I hung up with Marcus, I sat in my office chair staring at the wall for what felt like hours. Victoria had access to my business address because I'd been helping her with her real estate paperwork. She'd been to my office countless times and had seen me work on tax documents, business registrations, client contracts. She knew every detail of my business operations because I'd never hidden anything from her. Why would I? She was my sister. The betrayal hit me in waves. First came the shock of realizing what she'd done, then the anger at being used so completely. But underneath it all was a deeper hurt that took me longer to identify. Victoria had stolen from me, but more than that, she'd built an entire business venture without telling me about it. While I'd been sharing every detail of my life with her, she'd been operating in complete secrecy. I spent the rest of the morning making phone calls. Pacific Northwest Business Credit confirmed that the application had been submitted with my signature, though I was certain I'd never signed anything. Columbia River Bank initially refused to give me information about Victoria Chen Properties. But after I explained the situation and provided my business documentation, they agreed to investigate. The picture that emerged over the next few hours was devastating. Victoria had indeed started her own property management company 6 months ago. She'd been using my business credit history and financial credentials to secure not just this loan, but also lines of credit, vendor accounts, and commercial insurance policy. Every single document bore my signature, though I'd never seen any of them before. By lunchtime, I'd discovered that my sister had essentially stolen my entire business identity to fund her expansion into property management. The $200,000 loan was just the tip of the iceberg. She'd racked up nearly $400,000 in debt using my name and business credentials. I tried calling Victoria's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I drove to her downtown loft, but the doorman said she'd left for a business trip to Seattle that morning. I called Morrison Realty, but her assistant said Victoria was showing properties to out-of-town clients and wouldn't be available until Friday. It was almost like she knew this day was coming and had strategically made herself unavailable. That evening, I finally reached Victoria's best friend and business partner, Melissa Rodriguez. Melissa and Victoria had been inseparable since college, and if anyone knew what Victoria was up to, it would be her. Sarah. Hey, how are you? Victoria told me you might be calling. The casual way Melissa said it made my blood run cold. She told you I might be calling. About what? About the business loan stuff. Look, I know you're probably upset, but Victoria was planning to tell you everything this weekend. She's been working so hard to get Victoria Chen Properties off the ground, and she didn't want to bother you with all the boring financial details until she had everything figured out. I gripped the phone tighter. Melissa, she used my business information to secure loans without my permission. That's fraud. Oh, come on, Sarah. You're being so dramatic. It's not like she's some stranger who stole your identity. She's your sister. And honestly, she's doing really well with the property management thing. Those loans are going to be paid back in no time. Victoria always lands on her feet. The dismissive tone in Melissa's voice was like a slap. I don't care how well she's doing. She committed a felony using my name. You know what your problem is, Sarah? You're so uptight about everything. Victoria is out there taking risks and building something amazing, and all you can do is worry about paperwork and legal technicalities. Maybe if you supported your sister instead of freaking out about every little thing, you'd understand why she didn't want to involve you in the business side. The business side? Melissa, I am the business side. She used my business to do this, and now you're both going to benefit from it. Victoria Chen Properties is going to be huge. She's already got contracts with 3 major property development companies. This isn't some get-rich-quick scheme, Sarah. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. This is a legitimate business venture that's going to make both of you wealthy. I hung up without saying goodbye. The casual way Melissa had dismissed my concerns, the implication that I was being unreasonable for objecting to identity theft, the suggestion that I should be grateful for being included in a business venture I'd never agreed to participate in, it all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. This wasn't a desperate mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. Victoria had planned this. She'd discussed it with other people. She'd built an entire narrative around why using my identity without permission was actually a favor she was doing for me. I spent that night lying awake, replaying every conversation I'd had with Victoria over the past 6 months. Had there been signs I'd missed, hints about what she was planning? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Victoria had been carefully gathering information about my business operations for months. She'd asked detailed questions about my client contracts, claiming she was curious about how digital marketing worked. She'd offered to help organize my office files, saying she wanted to learn more about business administration. She'd even suggested I should expand into other services, asking specifically about the financial requirements for business growth. At the time, I'd been touched by her interest in my work. Victoria had never shown much curiosity about the technical aspects of my business before, and I'd interpreted her questions as a sign that she was finally taking my career seriously. Instead, she'd been conducting reconnaissance, gathering exactly the information she'd need to impersonate my business when applying for loans. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Patricia Huang, who specialized in business law and fraud cases. Patricia had helped me incorporate my consulting business 5 years earlier, and I trusted her judgment completely. "Sarah, I'm so sorry this happened to you," Patricia said after I'd explained the situation. "Unfortunately, identity theft between family members is more common than people realize, and it's often the most devastating because the victims never see it coming. What are my options? Can I file criminal charges?" "You absolutely can, and given the amounts involved, this would likely be prosecuted as a felony. However, I want you to understand the full implications. If Victoria is convicted, she'll face prison time, substantial fines, and her real estate license will almost certainly be revoked. This will essentially destroy her career and her life." I stared out my office window, watching the morning traffic crawl down Pine Street. Part of me wanted to see Victoria face consequences for what she'd done, but another part of me, the part that remembered teaching her to ride a bike and helping her with college applications, recoiled at the idea of sending my sister to prison. What if I don't press charges? What happens then? The debt is still in your name, so you'd be responsible for repaying all $400,000, unless Victoria voluntarily transfers everything back to her own name. Given that she'd need to qualify for that level of debt on her own credit, that seems unlikely. You'd also need to worry about future incidents. If she's done this once, there's nothing stopping her from doing it again. Patricia walked me through the process of documenting everything, freezing my business credit, and filing fraud reports with the major credit bureau. It was going to be a long, complicated process to untangle my legitimate business from Victoria's fraudulent activities. As I was leaving Patricia's office, my phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. "Hey sis, just got back from Seattle. Amazing trip. Want to grab dinner tonight? I have so much to tell you." The casual, cheerful tone of the message was surreal. After everything I'd discovered in the past 24 hours, Victoria was texting me like nothing had happened. Either she was completely oblivious to the fact that her loan fraud had been discovered, or she was so confident in her ability to manipulate the situation that she wasn't even worried. I texted back, "Sure. Your place at 7. I wanted to look Victoria in the eye when I confronted her. I wanted to see if my sister, the person I'd loved and protected my entire life, would lie to my face when directly asked about what she'd done." That afternoon, I prepared for the conversation by printing out every document Patricia had helped me gather: bank statements showing the fraudulent transactions, copies of loan applications bearing my forged signature, credit reports showing accounts I'd never opened, insurance policies for a business I'd never heard of. I also called my parents to give them a heads up about what was happening. My mother, Janet, was horrified. Sarah, there has to be some mistake. Victoria would never do something like this. You girls have always been so close. My father, Robert, was more pragmatic. If Victoria did this, she needs to face consequences. But are you sure you have all the facts? This seems very out of character for her. I promised to call them after I'd spoken with Victoria directly. Part of me hoped my parents were right, that there was some explanation that would make this all make sense. Maybe Victoria had genuinely believed she had my permission. Maybe she'd gotten bad advice from someone who told her this was legally acceptable between business partners. Maybe there was some detail I was missing that would change everything. By the time I arrived at Victoria's loft that evening, I'd almost convinced myself that this was all a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a frank conversation between sisters. Victoria opened the door with her trademark bright smile, wearing a flowing emerald dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her downtown loft was even more impressive than usual, with fresh flowers on every surface, and what looked like new furniture in the living room. Sarah, perfect timing. I just opened a bottle of that Pinot Grigio you love. Come in, come in. I followed her into the spacious living area, noting the new artwork on the walls, and the expensive-looking area rug that definitely hadn't been there the last time I'd visited. Victoria poured 2 glasses of wine, and settled onto the white leather sofa, patting the cushion beside her. You look stressed, sis. Everything okay with the business? The irony of the question was almost funny. Actually, Victoria, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I've been having some interesting conversations with lenders lately. Her expression didn't change, but I caught a brief flicker in her eyes. Oh? Are you thinking about expanding? That's so exciting. Not exactly. I got a call from Pacific Northwest Business Credit yesterday. Apparently I've been approved for a $200,000 loan that I never applied for. Victoria took a sip of wine, her face the picture of concern. That's weird. Did someone steal your identity? That's so scary, Sarah. You should definitely report that to the police. I watched her carefully as she spoke. If I hadn't known better, I would have been completely convinced by her performance. Victoria looked genuinely shocked and concerned, exactly the way you'd expect someone to react when hearing that their sister was a victim of identity theft. The strange thing is, I continued, the loan was disbursed to an account for a company called Victoria Chen Properties. Have you ever heard of that business? This time, the flicker in her eyes lasted longer. Victoria Chen Properties. That's such a weird coincidence. I mean, there are probably lots of people named Victoria Chen, right? It's not that uncommon of a name. I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder of documents I'd prepared. Actually, Victoria, I think we both know there's only one Victoria Chen who would have access to all my business information. The mask finally started to slip. Victoria set down her wine glass and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, calculating and cold. Sarah, I can explain everything. I'm listening. Victoria stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city. When she turned back to face me, her entire demeanor had changed. The bubbly, apologetic sister was gone, replaced by someone who looked like a stranger. You're right. I started Victoria Chen Properties, and yes, I used your business credentials to secure funding, but before you get all self-righteous about it, you need to understand why I had to do it this way. The casual admission hit me like a physical blow. You had to commit fraud. Don't be so dramatic, Sarah. It's not fraud when it's family. Everything I did benefits both of us. Victoria Chen Properties is going to be incredibly successful, and when it is, you'll be glad I had the vision to make it happen. I stared at my sister, trying to process the disconnect between her words and reality. Victoria, you stole my identity and racked up $400,000 in debt under my name. How does that benefit me? Because now you're a partner in something amazing, instead of being stuck in your little home office doing the same boring consulting work forever. Sarah, I've secured contracts with Meridian Development, Carson Holdings, and Westfield Property. These are major players in the Portland real estate market. Victoria Chen Properties is going to manage over 200 units by the end of the year. She was talking faster now, her voice taking on the enthusiastic sales pitch tone she used with real estate clients. The loan from Pacific Northwest was just seed money. With your business credit backing the operation, we can expand into commercial property management, maybe even property development. I'm talking about building an empire, Sarah, something that will set both of us up for life. I opened the folder and pulled out the loan documents. Victoria, look at these signatures. You forged my name on legal documents. That's a felony. She waved her hand dismissively. Those are just formalities. The important thing is the big picture. You've always been so focused on tiny details that you miss the forest for the trees. I'm trying to give us both a future that's bigger than anything we could build separately, a future built on lies and fraud. Victoria's expression hardened. You know what, Sarah? I'm disappointed but not surprised by your reaction. You've always been threatened by my success. Even when we were kids, you couldn't stand it when I got attention or praise for anything. The accusation was so unexpected and unfair that it left me speechless for a moment. This has nothing to do with jealousy, Victoria. This is about you committing crimes using my identity. Crimes? Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. I built a business, I found investors, I secured contracts. I did everything you've never had the courage to do, and now you want to destroy it because you're scared of taking risks. I could feel my anger building, but I forced myself to stay calm. If your business plan was so solid, why didn't you use your own credit to secure the loan? Because the lending market is biased against young women in real estate. Your business has a longer track record and better credit history. I knew that using Chen Digital Solutions as the foundation would give Victoria Chen Properties the credibility it needed to get off the ground. The rationalization was breathtaking in its audacity. Victoria had convinced herself that identity theft was actually a form of gender equality activism. So you decided to steal my business identity without asking me. I decided to leverage our family resources to create opportunities for both of us. And honestly, Sarah, if you were a real entrepreneur instead of someone who plays it safe with tiny consulting contracts, you would have seen the vision and wanted to be involved from the beginning. There it was, the real Victoria, stripped of all pretense. In her mind, I was the problem. I was the small-thinking sister who was too risk-averse to appreciate her grand scheme. She'd stolen my identity because she genuinely believed she was doing me a favor by forcing me into a business partnership I'd never agreed to. Victoria, I need you to transfer all these accounts back to your own name and take responsibility for the debt you've created. I'm not doing that. The flat refusal caught me off guard. Excuse me? I said I'm not doing that. Victoria Chen Properties is just getting started, and I'm not going to let you destroy it because you're too narrow-minded to see the potential. Those loans are in your name, which means you're already invested in this business, whether you like it or not. I stood up, my hands shaking with anger. You can't force me to be your business partner. Actually, I can, and I have. The paperwork is already filed. Chen Digital Solutions is listed as the parent company for Victoria Chen Properties. Congratulations, sis, you're officially in the property management business. The room felt like it was tilting. You filed paperwork without my consent. I filed paperwork that creates a legitimate business structure for our family's real estate ventures. Everything is completely legal now that the proper corporate relationships are established. I realized in that moment that Victoria had planned this entire conversation. She'd known I would discover the loans eventually, and she'd prepared a narrative that painted her identity theft as a business decision that I should be grateful for. Victoria, if you don't voluntarily correct this situation, I'm going to file criminal charges against you. For the first time since I'd arrived, Victoria looked genuinely surprised. You wouldn't do that. I'm your sister. You were my sister when you decided to steal my identity. Being family doesn't give you the right to commit felonies. Victoria's face flushed. You're seriously going to threaten me with prison because I created a business opportunity for both of us? Do you have any idea how many people would kill for the chance to get in on the ground floor of something like this? I don't want to get in on the ground floor of anything. I want my identity back. And I want you to take responsibility for your own debts, and I want you to stop being so selfish and short-sighted. We could build something incredible together, Sarah.
Victoria Chen Properties could become the biggest property management company in the Pacific Northwest, but only if you stop thinking like a small-time consultant and start thinking like a real entrepreneur. I gathered my documents and headed toward the door. You have 48 hours to contact all the lenders and transfer everything to your own name. If you don't, I'm filing a police report. Victoria followed me to the door, her voice rising with every step. You're making a huge mistake, Sarah.
You're throwing away the opportunity of a lifetime because you're too scared to take a real risk. Don't come crying to me when you're still doing the same boring consulting work 10 years from now while I'm running a multi-million-dollar company. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob and turned back to face her. Victoria, I'm going to ask you one more time. Will you transfer these accounts to your own name and take responsibility for what you've done? No, and if you try to sabotage Victoria Chen Properties out of spite, I'll make sure everyone knows that you were too petty and jealous to support your own sister's success. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Goodbye, Victoria. As I waited for the elevator, I could hear Victoria shouting from her doorway. You'll regret this, Sarah. You're destroying both our futures because you can't handle the fact that I'm better at business than you are. The elevator doors closed, cutting off her voice, and I rode down to the parking garage in silence. Part of me couldn't believe that the conversation had actually happened. The sister I'd grown up with, the person I'd loved and supported for 32 years, had just threatened to destroy my reputation if I didn't allow her to continue using my stolen identity to fund her business ventures. But as I drove home through the Portland streets, another part of me wasn't surprised at all. Looking back, I could see the pattern of behavior that had been building for years. Victoria had always expected special treatment, always found ways to make other people solve her problems, always believed that rules and consequences applied to everyone except her. The difference was that this time, she'd gone too far to cover it up with charm and manipulation. This time, she'd committed actual crimes, and when confronted, she'd doubled down instead of apologizing. I spent that night researching everything I could find about Victoria Chen Properties online. What I discovered was even more disturbing than I'd expected. Victoria hadn't just stolen my identity to secure loans, she'd been actively promoting herself as the CEO of a subsidiary of Chen Digital Solutions. Her LinkedIn profile listed her as Chief Executive Officer at Victoria Chen Properties, a division of Chen Digital Solutions. Her company website featured my business logo and described Victoria Chen Properties as the property management arm of Portland's premier digital marketing consultancy. Victoria had essentially hijacked my entire business brand to legitimize her new venture. Potential clients, looking into Victoria Chen Properties, would think they were working with an established company that had been operating successfully for years, when in reality they were dealing with a startup run by someone who had committed identity theft to fund her operation. I screenshot everything I could find and added it to the growing folder of evidence I was building. If Victoria thought she could intimidate me into accepting this situation, she was about to learn how wrong she was. The next morning, I called Patricia and told her about my conversation with Victoria. I'm not surprised by her reaction, Patricia said. People who commit identity theft often rationalize their behavior in exactly the way you've described. In Victoria's mind, she's not a criminal, she's an entrepreneur who found a creative solution to a funding problem. So what happens now? Now we document everything and file the police report. Given Victoria's refusal to cooperate, you don't have any choice but to pursue criminal charges. The longer this goes on, the more complicated it becomes to untangle your legitimate business from her fraudulent activities. I made an appointment to meet with Detective Maria Santos at the Portland Police Bureau's Economic Crimes Division that afternoon. Detective Santos was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in identity theft and financial fraud cases. Chen, I've reviewed the documentation you provided, and this is definitely a clear case of identity theft and fraud. Detective Santos said after I'd walked through the entire situation. The amounts involved and the sophistication of the scheme suggest this is a felony case that will likely be prosecuted by the district attorney's office. What happens to Victoria if she's convicted? Given the dollar amounts and the fact that this was an ongoing scheme rather than a single incident, she's looking at significant prison time. Oregon takes financial crime seriously, especially when they involve family members or business relationships where there's a high level of trust. I filed the police report that afternoon, providing copies of all the fraudulent loan documents, bank statements, and screenshots of Victoria's online claims about being affiliated with my business. Detective Santos assured me that they would begin investigating immediately. That evening, I called my parents to update them on the situation. The conversation was one of the most difficult I'd ever had. "Sarah, are you absolutely certain there's no other explanation?" my mother asked, her voice shaking. "Maybe Victoria made some mistakes with paperwork. But surely she didn't mean to hurt you." "Mom, she admitted everything to me last night. She's not even apologetic about it. She thinks she was doing me a favor." My father was quiet for a long time before speaking. "If Victoria really did what you're saying, then she needs to face consequences. But Sarah, filing criminal charges against your sister, that's going to tear this family apart. Victoria tore this family apart when she decided to steal my identity. I'm just refusing to pretend it didn't happen." The conversation ended with everyone in tears and no resolution. I understood my parents' position. They were being asked to choose between their daughters, and that was an impossible situation. But I also knew that if I didn't stand up for myself now, Victoria would continue escalating her behavior until she destroyed everything I'd worked to build. Over the next few days, I waited to hear from Victoria. Part of me expected her to call and apologize, to finally understand the seriousness of what she'd done, and agree to make things right. Instead, I got a call from Melissa Rodriguez. "Sarah, I cannot believe you filed a police report against your own sister. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've reported a crime that was committed against me. You've destroyed Victoria's life out of pure spite. She's been crying for 3 days straight. Her real estate license is going to be revoked. She could go to prison. And for what? Because she tried to include you in a business opportunity." The conversation with Melissa was almost identical to my confrontation with Victoria. The same dismissal of my concerns, the same insistence that I was overreacting, the same suggestion that I should be grateful for being involved in a business venture I'd never agreed to participate in. "Melissa, Victoria committed identity theft. She stole hundreds of thousands of dollars using my name. That's not a business opportunity. It's a felony." "You're being so dramatic, Sarah. Victoria was trying to help both of you build something bigger than either of you could create alone. Instead of supporting her vision, you're trying to send her to prison. What kind of sister does that?" I hung up on Melissa, just like I'd hung up on her before. But this time I realized something important. Victoria hadn't just stolen my identity. She'd built an entire support network of people who believed that her criminal behavior was actually entrepreneurial vision. The next call came from Victoria's real estate broker Jim Morrison. "Chen, I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding between you and Victoria regarding her property management business. I'm hoping we can resolve this situation without involving law enforcement." "It's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Morris. Victoria used my business identity to secure loans without my permission. That's fraud. I appreciate your position, but I want you to understand that Victoria is one of our most successful agents. She's brought in over $3 million in sales this year alone. If she loses her license over this situation, it's going to impact a lot of people, her clients, her colleagues, the company as a whole." The implication was clear. I should drop the charges to protect Victoria's career and the people who depended on her success. But I was tired of being asked to sacrifice my own interests to protect Victoria from the consequences of her choices. "Mr. Morrison, I didn't create this situation. Victoria did. If her actions impact other people, that's something she should have considered before committing fraud." "Ms. Chen, I understand you're upset, but surely there's a way to work this out within the family. Victoria has agreed to pay back any money that was improperly accessed. Isn't that what really matters?" Victoria has had multiple opportunities to pay back the money and transfer the accounts to her own name. She's refused to do so. At this point, the only way to protect myself is through the legal system. The conversation ended with Jim Morrison promising to speak with Victoria about finding a resolution that works for everyone. But I knew that any resolution Victoria agreed to would still involve me accepting responsibility for debt I'd never authorized, and allowing her to continue using my business identity for her property management company. 2 days later, I got the call I'd been expecting. Victoria's voice was completely different from the confident, dismissive tone she'd used during our confrontation. Now she sounded scared and desperate. "Sarah, please, we need to talk. The police came to my office today and interviewed me in front of all my colleagues. Everyone knows what's happening now. My broker is talking about suspending my license pending the outcome of the investigation. Victoria, I gave you multiple chances to resolve this voluntarily. You chose not to. I know I made mistakes. But Sarah, if I get convicted of this, my life is over. I'll lose my license, my business, probably my apartment. I could go to prison. Please. There has to be some way to work this out." For a moment I felt the familiar tug of sympathy that Victoria had always been able to trigger in me. This was my little sister, the person I'd protected and helped throughout our entire lives. The desperation in her voice was real, and despite everything she'd done, I didn't want to see her life destroyed. But then I remembered the cold calculation in her eyes when she'd refused to transfer the accounts back to my name. I remembered her threats to destroy my reputation if I didn't cooperate with her fraud. I remembered the casual way she'd dismissed my concerns and tried to gaslight me into believing that identity theft was actually a favor. "Victoria, the way to work this out was for you to voluntarily correct the situation when I first discovered it. You chose to double down instead. But I can fix it now. I'll transfer everything back to my own name. I'll take responsibility for all the debt. I'll shut down Victoria Chen Properties if that's what you want. Please. Sarah, I'm begging you." It was exactly what I'd asked for during our confrontation at her lot. If Victoria had agreed to these terms 2 weeks earlier, none of this would have escalated to criminal charges. But now I understood something crucial about my sister's pattern of behavior. Victoria only apologized and offered to make things right when she was facing serious consequences. As soon as the pressure was off, she'd go back to her entitled, manipulative behavior. If I dropped the charges now, I'd just be enabling the next time she decided to use my identity or my resources for her own purposes. "Victoria, I appreciate that you're finally willing to transfer the accounts, but it's too late for that to resolve the criminal charges. You committed fraud, and there have to be consequences. Sarah, please, I know I screwed up, but I'm your sister. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" It meant everything to me. That's why this hurts so much. You were the one person in the world I trusted completely, and you used that trust to steal from me. Victoria started crying on the phone, the kind of desperate sobbing that used to make me drop everything to comfort her. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought you'd understand once you saw how successful the business could be." The success was built on crimes, Victoria. Every contract you secured, every client you signed, every dollar you made, it was all based on fraudulent representation. Even if Victoria Chen Properties had become successful, it would still have been wrong. The desperation in Victoria's voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from her before, but I'd learned not to trust my sister's emotion. Every tear, every apology, every promise to change, it was all calculated to manipulate me into backing down from the consequences she'd brought on herself. "Victoria, if you really want to make this right, you can start by telling the truth to Detective Santos about everything you've done. Full disclosure, complete cooperation with the investigation." "I can't do that, Sarah. If I admit to everything, they'll definitely prosecute me. My lawyer says I should fight the charges and try to negotiate a plea deal." There it was. Even in her moment of supposed remorse, Victoria was still looking for ways to minimize her accountability. She wanted me to drop the charges so she could avoid consequences, but she wasn't willing to take full responsibility for what she'd done. "Then there's nothing more to discuss, Victoria." "Wait, don't hang up. What if I agree to pay you back, not just the loan amounts, but compensation for the damage to your business, your credit, everything? Name your price, Sarah. I'll figure out how to make it work." The offer was tempting, but I knew it was meaningless. Victoria didn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to pay me back, and even if she did, Money wouldn't repair the fundamental damage to our relationship. She'd proven that she saw me as a resource to be exploited rather than a sister to be respected. Victoria, this isn't about money anymore. This is about you understanding that actions have consequences, and that being family doesn't give you the right to commit crimes against me. You're destroying my life over paperwork, Sarah, over technical violations that don't actually hurt anyone. Victoria Chen Properties is a legitimate business with real clients and real revenue. The loans are being repaid on schedule. No one is losing money, even facing criminal charges. Victoria still couldn't understand what she'd done wrong. In her mind, the fraud was justified by the success of her business. The fact that she'd built that success on stolen identity and forged documents was just a technical violation that shouldn't matter. Goodbye, Victoria. I hung up and immediately called Detective Santos to report Victoria's attempt to contact me. Santos explained that it was normal for defendants to try to pressure victims into dropping charges, but that the investigation would proceed regardless of whether Victoria and I worked out a private resolution. Ms. Chen, I want you to understand that this case is going forward whether your sister cooperates or not. We have enough evidence to prosecute based on the documentation you've provided. Her best option at this point is to work with the district attorney's office on a plea agreement. Over the next few weeks, the full scope of Victoria's fraud began to emerge through the police investigation. It turned out that the loans and credit lines I'd discovered were just the beginning. Victoria had been using my business identity for almost 8 months, gradually escalating from small credit applications to major loan requests. She'd opened business credit cards in my name, established vendor accounts with construction supply companies, purchased expensive software licenses for property management systems, even rented office space using my business credentials as collateral. The total amount of debt she'd accumulated using my identity was closer to $600,000, not the $400,000 I'd initially calculated. Detective Santos also discovered that Victoria had created elaborate documentation to support her fraud. She'd forged my signature on dozens of documents, created fake email accounts that appeared to be from Chen Digital Solutions, and even produced falsified business records showing revenue and client relationships that didn't exist. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, Chen Detective Santos explained during one of our meetings. Your sister planned this fraud carefully over many months. She studied your business operations, practiced forging your signature, and created sophisticated documentation to support her deception. The revelation that Victoria had been planning this for months was somehow more devastating than the original discovery of the fraud. It meant that all those conversations where she'd asked about my business, all those times she'd offered to help with filing an organization, all those moments where I'd thought she was finally taking interest in my work, she'd been setting me up to be victimized. The investigation also revealed that Victoria had been bragging about her schemes to other people. Text messages recovered from her phone showed conversations with Melissa and several other friends, where Victoria had described her fraud as creative financing and leveraging family resources. In one particularly damning message to Melissa, Victoria had written, "Sarah is so naive about business. She thinks small and plays it safe because she's scared of real success. I'm building something that will benefit both of us whether she likes it or not." Sometimes you have to save people from themselves. Reading those messages was like looking into the mind of a stranger. The Victoria who had written those texts wasn't someone who had made a desperate mistake or succumbed to temporary bad judgment. She was someone who had systematically planned to exploit my trust and steal my identity while convincing herself that she was doing me a favor. Meanwhile, the impact on my own business was becoming clearer every day. Several of my long-term clients had received calls from Victoria's creditors asking about Chen Digital Solutions' involvement in property management ventures. My business credit score had plummeted due to the high debt-to-income ratio created by Victoria's loan. 3 potential new clients had backed out of contracts after discovering the confusion surrounding my business identity. I spent countless hours on the phone with banks, credit agencies, and vendor companies, trying to prove that I wasn't responsible for the debts Victoria had created in my name. Even with a police report and fraud documentation, many institutions required extensive paperwork and legal affidavits before they would remove the fraudulent accounts from my credit history.
The most frustrating part was dealing with some of Victoria's business partners and clients, who had been told that Chen Digital Solutions was backing Victoria, Chen Properties. Several property owners had signed management contracts based on the assumption that they were working with an established, well-funded company rather than a startup built on fraud. One particularly difficult conversation was with Robert Chang, a property developer who had signed a contract for Victoria to manage a new condominium complex. Ms. Chen, I need to understand what's happening with your property management division. We've invested significant money in marketing and leasing, based on Victoria's representations about your company's capabilities. Mr. Chang, I don't have a property management division. Victoria Chen Properties is not affiliated with my business. Victoria used my company's identity without permission to create the appearance of an established business relationship, but the contracts clearly show Chen Digital Solutions as the parent company. Victoria provided documentation showing your business registration, financial statements, client references. Are you saying all of that was fabricated? I'm saying that Victoria had access to my legitimate business information and used it to create fraudulent documentation for her own company. Any contracts that reference Chen Digital Solutions as being involved in property management are void. Robert was understandably upset about the situation, but his anger was directed at me rather than Victoria. In his mind, I was the business owner who was suddenly reneging on commitments that my subsidiary had made. The fact that Victoria had committed fraud to create those commitments didn't matter to him. He was facing financial losses because of the confusion she'd created. These conversations happened almost daily as more of Victoria's clients and business partners discovered the truth about her fraudulent business structure. Some were understanding once I explained the situation, but others treated me as if I was trying to escape responsibility for legitimate business obligations. The stress was overwhelming. I found myself working twice as hard just to maintain my existing client relationships, while spending enormous amounts of time dealing with the legal and financial aftermath of Victoria's fraud. Several nights, I stayed up until 3 in the morning, researching business fraud laws and documenting every aspect of Victoria's deception. 3 weeks after filing the police report, I received a call from Assistant District Attorney Michelle Park, who would be prosecuting Victoria's case. Ms. Chen, I wanted to update you on the status of the investigation. We're moving forward with formal charges against your sister. Given the scope and duration of the fraud, we're charging her with multiple counts of identity theft, forgery, and wire fraud. If convicted on all counts, she could face up to 15 years in prison. The severity of the potential sentence was sobering. Despite everything Victoria had done, 15 years seemed like an enormous consequence for financial crime. But Adia Park explained that the charges reflected not just the dollar amounts involved, but the sophisticated nature of the fraud and the violation of family trust. White-collar crimes involving family members are taken very seriously by our office. Ms. Your sister didn't just steal money, she systematically violated one of the most fundamental relationships in society. That kind of calculated betrayal deserves significant consequence. I asked about the possibility of a plea agreement, and Adia Park explained that Victoria's attorney had reached out about negotiations, but Victoria was still maintaining her innocence on most of the charges. Your sister's position seems to be that she had some kind of implied permission to use your business identity, because your family members who had previously shared business resources. Obviously that's not a valid legal defense, but it suggests she's not ready to accept full responsibility for her actions.
Even facing 15 years in prison, Victoria was still trying to minimize her accountability. She was still telling herself and her lawyer that somehow her fraud was justified because we were sisters, and I had helped her with legitimate business tasks in the past. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following month, and I would need to testify about the discovery of the fraud and my conversations with Victoria. Adia Park warned me that Victoria's defense attorney would likely try to portray our relationship as a business partnership that had gone wrong rather than a clear case of identity theft. They'll probably argue that there was some ambiguity about your consent to the business relationship, or that you were aware of some aspects of Victoria's activities and chose not to object. Be prepared for them to question your motives for filing charges and suggest that this is really a family dispute rather than a criminal matter. The idea that Victoria's legal team would try to twist our relationship into something that justified her crimes was infuriating, but not surprising. Throughout this entire ordeal, everyone in Victoria's orbit had tried to reframe her criminal behavior as normal business practices or family dynamics. During this time, I also had to deal with the ongoing impact on my relationship with my parents. They were caught in an impossible position, trying to support both daughters while processing the reality that one of us had committed serious crimes against the other. My mother called me almost every day, usually crying, begging me to find some way to resolve the situation that wouldn't result in Victoria going to prison. "Sarah, she's your baby sister. You taught her to ride a bike, helped her with her homework, drove her to college interviews. How can you send her to prison?" "Mom, I didn't send her anywhere. Victoria made choices that have consequences. I'm not responsible for protecting her from those consequences. But family is supposed to forgive each other. People make mistakes, even big ones. Isn't there some way to work this out?" These conversations were heartbreaking because I understood my mother's perspective. From her point of view, she was watching her family disintegrate over money and legal technicality. She couldn't fully grasp the calculated nature of Victoria's betrayal or understand why financial crimes were serious enough to warrant destroying family relationships. My father was more supportive of my decision to pursue charges, but even he struggled with the potential consequences. "Sarah, I understand why you filed the police report, and I think Victoria needs to face some kind of consequences. But 15 years in prison seems extreme for a financial crime where no one was physically hurt." "Dad, Victoria didn't just steal money. She stole my entire business identity and used it to create a fraudulent company. She's destroyed my credit, damaged my reputation, and put me at risk for hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt I never authorized. The only reason no one was physically hurt is because I discovered what she was doing before she could do even more damage." The conversations with my parents highlighted one of the most difficult aspects of this entire situation. People who had never been victims of identity theft often couldn't understand the profound violation involved. They saw it as a financial crime that could be resolved by paying back money, rather than understanding the deeper betrayal of trust and the ongoing damage to my life and business. Meanwhile, Victoria had apparently been conducting her own campaign to win sympathy and support from extended family members and mutual friends. I started getting calls from cousins, family friends, and even some of my own clients who had somehow heard Victoria's version of events. My cousin Rachel called me one evening, clearly having been primed by Victoria with a particular narrative. "Sarah, I heard about the situation with Victoria and the business loan. I know you're upset, but don't you think you're overreacting a little? Victoria is going through such a hard time right now and she's always looked up to you. Maybe she made some mistakes with paperwork, but surely you can work this out without involving the police." The casual way Rachel dismissed identity theft as mistakes with paperwork showed how effectively Victoria had been spinning the story. In Victoria's version, apparently, she was a struggling entrepreneur who had made some technical errors while trying to build a business, and I was an unreasonable sister who was using legal technicalities to destroy her life. Rachel, Victoria didn't make mistakes with paperwork. She systematically stole my business identity over a period of 8 months and used it to fraudulently obtain hundreds of thousands of dollars in loans and credit. That's not a family dispute. It's a serious crime. But she's family, Sarah. Surely that has to count for something. And from what I understand, she was planning to include you in the business anyway. Maybe she should have asked first. But her intentions were good. This conversation, like so many others during this period, made me realize how effectively Victoria had manipulated the narrative around her crime. She'd convinced people that identity theft was just poor communication, that fraud was just enthusiasm, and that my decision to hold her accountable was unreasonable and vindictive. The most disturbing call came from Jim Morrison, Victoria's real estate broker, who had apparently decided to take a more aggressive approach to protecting his star agent. "Chen, I've been talking with some colleagues in the legal community, and there seems to be some question about whether your sister's actions really constitute criminal fraud. Given that you're family members who have shared business resources in the past, it's possible that a jury might see this as a civil dispute rather than a criminal matter. The thinly veiled threat was clear. Victoria's supporters were preparing to argue that her crimes weren't really crimes at all, just misunderstandings between family members. They were going to try to use our history of mutual support against me, claiming that because I'd helped Victoria with legitimate business tasks in the past, she had some kind of implied permission to steal my identity. Mr. Morrison, there's no ambiguity about what Victoria did. She forged my signature on legal documents, created false business records, and used my identity to obtain loans without my knowledge or consent. That's fraud regardless of our family relationship. I understand your position, Chen, but I hope you'll consider the broader impact of this situation. Victoria is a valuable member of our business community. She's helped dozens of families find homes and has contributed significantly to Portland's economic development. Destroying her career over what might be characterized as a family business dispute seems disproportionate. The conversation with Jim Morrison crystallized something important for me. Victoria's supporters weren't just defending her actions. They were actively trying to redefine criminal behavior as acceptable business practice. They were arguing that success and community contribution should excuse fraud, and that family relationship should provide immunity from criminal prosecution. This perspective was deeply troubling because it suggested that people like Victoria, charming, successful, well-connected individuals, should be held to different standards than everyone else. If Victoria could steal hundreds of thousands of dollars using my identity and face no consequences because she was family and successful, what message did that send about accountability and justice? I started documenting these pressure campaigns, saving voicemails and text messages from people who were trying to convince me to drop the charges. Adia Park had warned me that this might happen, and advised me to report any attempts at witness intimidation or coercion. While dealing with this external pressure, I was also trying to rebuild my business and repair the damage Victoria had caused. The fraud investigation had revealed several areas where Victoria's activities had created ongoing problems for my legitimate business operation. For example, Victoria had signed service agreements with vendors using my business name, committing Chen Digital Solutions to pay for services I'd never authorized. A landscaping company was demanding payment for work done at properties managed by Victoria Chen Properties, claiming they had a valid contract with my business. A software company was threatening to take legal action for unpaid licenses that Victoria had purchased using my business credit. Each of these situations required hours of legal work to resolve. I had to prove repeatedly that I wasn't responsible for commitments Victoria had made in my name, provide documentation showing that I'd never authorized these expenditures, and often hire my own attorney to protect my interests when vendors refused to accept that they'd been defrauded. The financial cost of cleaning up Victoria's fraud was enormous, even aside from the actual loan amounts. Legal fees, credit monitoring services, document preparation, lost business opportunities. The hidden costs of identity theft were adding up to tens of thousands of dollars. But the emotional cost was even higher. Every day brought new reminders of how thoroughly Victoria had violated my trust. Opening my mail meant discovering new accounts or services that had been established in my name. Checking my email meant finding messages from Victoria's creditors or business partners who thought I was responsible for her commitments. The worst part was the ongoing uncertainty about what other fraud might be discovered. Even though the police investigation had uncovered the major elements of Victoria's scheme, I lived with constant anxiety that there might be other loans, accounts, or commitments that hadn't been discovered yet. 3 weeks before the preliminary hearing, I received an unexpected call from Victoria's attorney, David Brennan. Ms. Chen, I represent your sister Victoria in the criminal charges that have been filed. I'm calling to see if there might be an opportunity to resolve this situation without proceeding to trial. I was immediately suspicious of the call. Adia Park had advised me not to negotiate directly with Victoria's defense team and to refer any settlement discussions to the prosecutor's office. Mr. Brennan, I think any discussions about plea agreements should go through the district attorney's office. I understand your position, but I wanted to speak with you directly about some information that might change your perspective on this situation. Are you aware that your sister has been receiving treatment for a mental health condition that may have impaired her judgment during the time period when these alleged offenses occurred? The suggestion that Victoria's fraud could be excused by mental health issues was both insulting and predictable. Throughout our entire relationship, Victoria had never shown any signs of mental illness. She'd always been calculating, manipulative, and entitled, but those were personality traits, not psychiatric conditions. Mr. Brennan, Victoria's mental health history is not something I'm going to discuss with you. If you have medical information that's relevant to her case, you should present it to the appropriate court. I appreciate your position, but I think you should know that Victoria has been diagnosed with a condition that can cause impaired judgment regarding financial decisions and interpersonal relationships. The actions she took may have been symptoms of this condition rather than deliberate criminal behavior. It was exactly the kind of excuse I'd expected Victoria's legal team to develop. Rather than accepting responsibility for her crimes, they were going to argue that she was mentally ill and therefore not fully responsible for her actions. Mr. Brennan, even if Victoria has mental health issues, that doesn't change the fact that she systematically planned and executed a sophisticated fraud over many months. Mental illness doesn't excuse criminal behavior. That's certainly one way to look at it, Miss Ch. But another perspective is that your sister was struggling with a medical condition that affected her ability to understand the consequences of her actions. With proper treatment, she could make full restitution and ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Brennan essentially arguing that Victoria deserved sympathy rather than prosecution because of her alleged mental health issue. He also suggested that proceeding with criminal charges would be vindictive and unnecessary given that Victoria was now receiving treatment and was committed to making things right. I ended the call by reiterating that any plea discussions should go through the district attorney's office, but the conversation left me deeply unsettled. It was clear that Victoria's defense strategy was going to be built around portraying her as a victim of circumstances beyond her control rather than taking responsibility for her deliberate criminal behavior. The mental health excuse was particularly galling because it continued the pattern of deflecting responsibility that had characterized Victoria's response to being caught. First, she'd argued that her fraud was actually a business opportunity I should be grateful for. Then she'd claimed that family relationships justified identity theft. Now, she was apparently going to argue that mental illness excused criminal behavior. At no point in this entire process had Victoria simply acknowledged that she'd made wrong choices and accepted full responsibility for the consequences. Every response had been designed to minimize her accountability and shift blame to other factors. My lack of business vision, family dynamics, mental health issues, whatever excuse seemed most likely to generate sympathy. I called Adia Park to report the conversation with Victoria's attorney and to understand what the mental health defense might mean for the case. Ms. Chen, it's not uncommon for defendants in white-collar crime cases to claim that mental health issues contributed to their criminal behavior. However, mental illness rarely constitutes a complete defense to fraud charges, especially when the defendant demonstrated the level of planning and sophistication that your sister exhibited. Park explained that even if Victoria could prove she had a diagnosable mental health condition, she would still need to show that this condition prevented her from understanding that her actions were wrong or from controlling her behavior. Given the evidence of careful planning and the sophisticated nature of the fraud, that would be very difficult to prove. The fact that your sister was able to research loan requirements, forge documents convincingly and maintain the deception for months suggests that she understood exactly what she was doing and why it was wrong. Mental health issues might be considered as a mitigating factor during sentencing, but they're unlikely to result in dismissal of the charges. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, and I was becoming increasingly anxious about the experience of testifying. I'd never been involved in a criminal case before, and the thought of facing Victoria in court while describing her crimes was emotionally overwhelming. Adia Park arranged for me to meet with a victim advocate, Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in helping people navigate the criminal justice process. Jennifer explained what to expect during the hearing and provided strategies for handling the stress of testifying against a family member. Miss Chin, one of the most difficult aspects of your situation is that you're dealing with both the crime itself and the betrayal by someone you trust. Many victims of identity theft struggle with feelings of guilt, wondering if they somehow enabled the crime or could have prevented it. Jennifer was right that I'd been struggling with those exact feelings. Despite knowing intellectually that Victoria's crimes weren't my fault, I couldn't stop thinking about all the ways I'd made it easier for her to victimize me. I'd given her access to my office, shared information about my business operations, helped her with legitimate tasks that gave her insight into my financial systems. It's important to remember that trust isn't a crime, Miss Chen. You didn't do anything wrong by treating your sister like family. The fact that she violated that trust reflects her character, not yours. Jennifer also prepared me for the possibility that Victoria's defense team would try to make me look vindictive or unreasonable during cross-examination. They might suggest that I was overreacting to a family dispute, that I had somehow contributed to the confusion about business relationships, or that I was motivated by jealousy of Victoria's success. The most important thing is to stick to the facts and not let them provoke you into emotional responses. Your sister committed specific criminal acts. Focus on those actions and their impact on you, rather than getting drawn into arguments about family dynamics or business philosophy. As the preliminary hearing approached, I found myself thinking constantly about how our family had reached this point. Victoria and I had grown up in the same house, with the same parents, the same values, the same opportunities. What had made her believe that she was entitled to steal from me? What had convinced her that family relationships provided immunity from basic ethical standards? I kept coming back to patterns of behavior that I'd noticed, but not fully understood over the years. Victoria had always been comfortable with moral ambiguity in ways that made me uncomfortable. She'd cheat on tests in school but rationalize it by saying everyone else was doing it. She'd tell elaborate lies to our parents about where she was going or what she was doing, then act hurt when she was caught. As an adult, Victoria had continued this pattern of bending rules and manipulating situations to her advantage. She'd exaggerated her credentials on job applications, claiming experience she didn't have. She'd manipulated romantic relationships by telling different stories to different people. She'd taken credit for work done by colleagues and blamed others for her own mistakes. At the time, I'd dismissed these behaviors as minor character flaws or signs that Victoria was still maturing. I'd told myself that everyone had imperfections and that Victoria's positive qualities outweighed her tendency toward dishonesty and manipulation. But now I could see that Victoria's fraud wasn't an aberration. It was the logical escalation of a lifelong pattern of believing that rules didn't apply to her, and that other people existed primarily to serve her needs. The only difference was that this time, her victim was someone who couldn't be charmed or manipulated into accepting her behavior. The night before the preliminary hearing, my parents called to make one final plea for me to reconsider pressing charges. "Sarah, we know Victoria made serious mistakes, but she's still our daughter and your sister," my mother said through tears. "If she goes to prison, it will destroy her life and tear our family apart forever." "Mom, Victoria destroyed her own life when she decided to commit fraud, and she tore our family apart when she chose to steal my identity rather than asking for help honestly. But people make mistakes, even terrible ones. Isn't forgiveness supposed to mean something? Isn't family supposed to mean something?" The question haunted me as I tried to sleep that night. Family did mean something to me. It meant everything. That's exactly why Victoria's betrayal was so devastating. She hadn't just stolen money, she'd destroyed the fundamental trust that made our relationship possible. I'd spent 32 years believing that Victoria and I were partners in life, people who would always have each other's backs, no matter what happened. Learning that she saw me as a resource to be exploited rather than a sister to be respected had shattered my understanding of our entire relationship. Forgiveness might be possible someday, but it couldn't come at the cost of accountability. If I dropped the charges now, I'd be sending Victoria the message
that family relationships provided immunity from consequences, and that she could betray my trust without facing any real penalties for her actions. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning at the Multnomah County Courthouse. As I walked up the steps to the building, I felt like I was entering a different world. One where the comfortable assumptions of family loyalty and unconditional love had been replaced by evidence and testimony and legal consequences. I'd spent months dealing with the practical aftermath of Victoria's fraud, but this was the first time I'd have to face her directly since our confrontation at her loft. I wondered if she'd look different, if the stress of criminal charges had changed her appearance or demeanor. I wondered if she'd try to make eye contact with me, or if she'd avoid looking in my direction. Most of all, I wondered if she finally understood what she'd done and felt genuine remorse for her actions, or if she was still convinced that somehow she was the victim in this situation. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with just a few rows of seats for observers. Victoria was already seated at the defense table with her attorney, wearing a conservative navy blue dress that made her look younger and more vulnerable than usual. She kept her eyes focused on the papers in front of her and didn't look up when I entered the room. Adia Park had explained that the preliminary hearing was relatively straightforward. The prosecution just needed to present enough evidence to show that a crime had likely been committed, and that Victoria was likely the person who committed it. The defense would have an opportunity to cross-examine witnesses and challenge evidence, but they wouldn't present their full case until trial. I was called to testify first, and as I walked to the witness stand, I finally made eye contact with Victoria. For just a moment, I saw a flash of the sister I'd grown up with, someone who looked scared and lost and desperately sorry for the pain she'd caused. But then the moment passed, and her expression became neutral and distant again. Under direct examination by Adia Park, I described discovering the fraudulent loans, confronting Victoria about what she'd done, and her refusal to voluntarily correct the situation. I explained how Victoria had used my business identity to create Victoria Chen Properties, and the impact her fraud had on my legitimate business operations. The testimony was emotionally difficult but straightforward. I stuck to the facts, describing specific actions and conversations without editorializing about Victoria's motives or character. Adia Park had coached me to let the evidence speak for itself, rather than trying to convince the judge that Victoria was a bad person. Victoria's attorney, David Brennan, approached the cross-examination carefully, clearly aware that attacking me too aggressively might backfire by making Victoria look unsympathetic. Ms. Chen, you testified that you and your sister had a close relationship and that you'd helped her with various business-related tasks over the years. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. And you allowed her to use your business address for her real estate activities, correct? Yes, I allowed her to use my address for legitimate mail forwarding. You also shared information about your business operations with Victoria, including details about your clients, your revenue, and your business practices, correct? I could see where Brennan was heading with this line of questioning. He was trying to establish that Victoria had legitimate access to my business information, and that our relationship was ambiguous enough that she might have reasonably believed she had permission to use my identity for business purposes. I shared general information about my work with Victoria, because she's my sister and I thought she was interested in learning about my business. I never gave her permission to use my business identity for her own venture. But you never explicitly told her that she couldn't use your business information, did you? I never explicitly told her not to steal my car either, but that doesn't mean she had permission to take it. Adia Park had warned me that Brennan might try to make normal family sharing look like business partnership, and this was exactly what he was doing. He spent several more minutes asking detailed questions about every instance where I'd helped Victoria with legitimate tasks, trying to create the impression that our relationship was more like a business collaboration than a typical sibling relationship. The cross-examination was frustrating because it required me to defend normal family behavior as if it had been suspicious or inappropriate. According to Brennan's logic, helping Victoria with her real estate paperwork meant I'd somehow consented to having my identity stolen for her property management business, but I could tell that Judge Martinez wasn't buying the defense's argument. When Brennan suggested that Victoria might have reasonably believed she had permission to use my business identity, the judge interrupted to ask for specific evidence supporting that claim. Brennan, are you arguing that the defendant had explicit permission from the victim to sign loan documents in her name? Your Honor, I'm suggesting that the relationship between these family members was complex and that there may have been ambiguity about the scope of business collaboration that was permitted. I'm not hearing any evidence of explicit permission for the specific actions that constitute the charged offenses. Please move on to your next line of questioning. The exchange made it clear that Judge Martinez understood the difference between normal family support and criminal fraud. Brennan's efforts to blur that distinction weren't succeeding, and he seemed to realize it because he wrapped up the cross-examination quickly after the judge's intervention. The prosecution also called Detective Santos to testify about the investigation and the evidence that had been gathered. Santos described the sophisticated nature of Victoria's fraud, the forged documents that had been recovered, and the text messages showing that Victoria had planned the scheme over several months. Under cross-examination, Brennan tried to challenge the interpretation of some of the text messages, suggesting that Victoria's references to creative financing and leveraging family resources were just casual expressions rather than evidence of criminal intent. But Detective Santos was well prepared for these questions and methodically walked through the evidence showing that Victoria had deliberately concealed her activities from me while systematically stealing my business identity. The defendant's text messages show that she was aware her sister didn't know about the loan applications and would likely object if she found out. This demonstrates consciousness of wrongdoing rather than any belief that she had permission for her action. The final witness was Marcus Webb from Pacific Northwest Business Credit, who testified about Victoria's loan application and the documentation she had provided. Webb explained that all the business information on the application had matched Chen Digital Solutions' legitimate records, but that the signature on the application was clearly different from my actual signature on file. We require multiple forms of verification for large business loans, including signature comparison and documentation review. In this case, the applicant provided extensive business documentation that appeared legitimate, but the signature analysis showed clear differences from the account holder's signature on file. Under cross-examination, Brennan tried to suggest that signature variations might be normal and that the loan approval process hadn't been rigorous enough to detect legitimate concerns about the application.
But Webb was adamant that the differences in signature were significant enough to indicate forgery, and that Victoria had provided false information when she claimed to be authorized to sign loan documents on behalf of Chen Digital Solutions. After both sides had presented their evidence, Judge Martinez announced that there was sufficient probable cause to believe that Victoria had committed the charged offenses and that the case would proceed to trial. The judge also denied Brennan's motion to reduce Victoria's charges, stating that the evidence supported the prosecution's theory that this was sophisticated fraud rather than a misunderstanding between family members. As the hearing concluded, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the legal system had recognized Victoria's actions as serious crimes that deserved prosecution, but sadness that our family situation had deteriorated to the point where we were facing each other across a courtroom, rather than working together to solve problems. Victoria finally looked directly at me as she was leaving the courtroom, and for a moment I thought she might try to speak to me. But then David Brennan guided her toward the exit, and the opportunity passed. Outside the courthouse, Ada Park explained that Victoria's attorney would likely try to negotiate a plea agreement over the next few weeks, but that the prosecution was prepared to go to trial if necessary. Ms. Chen, I want you to understand that your testimony today was exactly what we needed to establish the case. The judge clearly understood that this was criminal fraud rather than a family dispute, and that's going to make it very difficult for the defense to avoid conviction at trial. I drove home, feeling emotionally drained but legally vindicated. The preliminary hearing had confirmed that Victoria's crimes were serious enough to warrant prosecution, and that her attempts to reframe identity theft as a family misunderstanding weren't legally viable. But I also knew that this was just the beginning of a process that could take months or even years to resolve completely. Even if Victoria was convicted and sentenced, I'd still have to deal with the ongoing practical consequences of her fraud, repairing my credit, rebuilding my business reputation, and managing the financial impact of her crime. Most challenging of all, I'd have to figure out how to move forward with my life knowing that the person I'd trusted more than anyone else in the world had systematically betrayed that trust for her own financial gain. The legal system could hold Victoria accountable for her crimes, but it couldn't repair the fundamental damage to our relationship or restore my faith in family loyalty. As I sat in my office that evening, looking at the stack of legal documents and financial records that had become my life, I realized that Victoria had stolen more than just money. She'd stolen my sense of security, my ability to trust, and my belief that family bonds were sacred and unbreakable. Those losses were far more devastating than any financial damage she'd caused. 2 months after the preliminary hearing, David Brennan called Ada Park to discuss a potential plea agreement. Victoria was apparently ready to accept responsibility for some of the charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, but she was still maintaining that her actions had been motivated by mental health issues rather than criminal intent. The proposed plea deal would have Victoria plead guilty to 3 counts of identity theft and 1 count of wire fraud, with the remaining charges dropped. In exchange, she would serve 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, during which she would be required to make full restitution and undergo mandatory counseling. Ada Park called me to discuss whether I would support the plea agreement. Ms. Chen, the proposed sentence is significantly less than what Victoria could face if convicted at trial, but it does ensure that she'll face real consequences for her action. The restitution requirement means you'd eventually recover the financial losses, and the counseling requirement addresses the mental health issues her attorney has raised. I thought carefully about the offer. 18 months in prison seemed like a light sentence for someone who had committed such sophisticated fraud over such an extended period. But going to trial would mean months more of legal proceedings, testimony, and reliving the details of Victoria's betrayal. More importantly, the plea agreement would require Victoria to formally admit guilt and accept responsibility for her crimes. After months of deflection and excuse-making, having Victoria acknowledge in court that she had committed fraud against me felt like an important form of vindication. I'll support the plea agreement if Victoria makes a full allocution, admitting exactly what she did and acknowledging the harm she caused. Ada Park explained that the allocution would require Victoria to describe her crimes in detail and confirm that she understood they were wrong. She would also have to acknowledge the impact her actions had on me personally and professionally. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following month, and I was given the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement that would be considered during sentencing. Writing that statement forced me to confront the full scope of what Victoria had done to my life. Beyond the obvious financial damage, Victoria's fraud had destroyed my sense of personal security and my ability to trust other people. I'd become hypervigilant about protecting my personal information, suspicious of anyone who showed interest in my business operations, and unable to enjoy the kind of casual family relationships I'd taken for granted before. The fraud had also damaged my professional reputation in ways that would take years to fully repair. Several potential clients had decided not to work with me after discovering the confusion surrounding my business identity. Industry colleagues had started treating me differently once word spread about the criminal investigation. Most painfully, Victoria's crimes had destroyed our family relationships in ways that might never heal. My parents were devastated by the situation and struggled to maintain relationships with both daughters without appearing to take sides. Extended family members had chosen sides based on Victoria's manipulative version of events, creating divisions that extended far beyond our immediate family. Writing the victim impact statement was emotionally exhausting, but it also helped me understand the full scope of what I'd lost and why holding Victoria accountable was so important. Her crimes weren't just financial violations, they were attacks on the fundamental trust that makes family relationships possible. The plea hearing took place on a cold December morning 6 months after I'd first discovered Victoria's. The courtroom was nearly empty except for our immediate family, a few court officials, and a handful of observers who seemed to be law students or journalists covering the case. Victoria looked dramatically different from the confident, polished woman who had dismissed my concerns at her downtown loft. She'd lost weight, her hair was shorter and less styled, and she wore a simple black dress that made her look older and more serious than usual. When Judge Martinez asked Victoria to enter her plea, she stood and spoke in a voice that was barely audible. "Guilty. Your Honor." The judge then required Victoria to describe her crimes in detail, confirming that she understood exactly what she had done and why it was wrong. This allocution was one of the most difficult things I'd ever witnessed, hearing my sister formally admit to systematically betraying my trust and stealing my identity. I used my sister Sarah's business information to fraudulently obtain loans and credit totaling approximately $600,000. I forged her signature on multiple legal documents and created false business records to support my deception. I did this without her knowledge or consent, and I understand that my actions constituted serious crimes that caused significant harm to my sister personally and professionally. Victoria's voice broke several times during the allocution, and I could see that she was genuinely struggling with having to acknowledge the full scope of her crimes. For someone who had spent months minimizing and rationalizing her behavior, admitting to deliberate fraud was clearly difficult. Judge Martinez then invited me to read my victim impact statement. Standing at the podium and looking directly at Victoria while describing how her crimes had affected my life was one of the most emotionally challenging experiences I'd ever endured. Your Honor, Victoria's crimes have caused damage that extends far beyond the financial losses. She violated the most fundamental trust between family members and used my love for her as a weapon against me. The sister I thought I knew, someone I would have done anything to help, never actually existed. The real Victoria was someone who saw me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected. I went on to describe the ongoing impact on my business, my relationships, and my ability to trust other people. I explained how Victoria's fraud had forced me to question every assumption I'd made about family loyalty and unconditional love. Victoria had countless opportunities to ask for help honestly, and I would have done everything in my power to support her legitimate business goals. Instead, she chose to steal from me while pretending to care about our relationship. That betrayal will affect how I relate to other people for the rest of my life. When I finished reading the statement, Judge Martinez asked Victoria if she wanted to respond. Victoria stood and turned to face me directly for the first time since the legal proceedings had begun. Sarah, I know that saying I'm sorry doesn't fix what I've done or give you back what I've taken from you. I convinced myself that I was helping both of us, but I know now that I was just being selfish and dishonest. I destroyed the most important relationship in my life because I was too proud to ask for help and too greedy to respect your boundaries. Victoria's apology seemed genuine, but it was also too little too late. The time for apologies had been during our confrontation at her loft, when she could have chosen to make things right voluntarily. By the time she was standing in a courtroom facing criminal penalties, her expressions of remorse felt more like attempts to minimize her sentence than genuine acknowledgments of wrongdoing. Judge Martinez sentenced Victoria to 24 months in prison, 6 months longer than the recommended sentence in the plea agreement. The judge explained that the additional time reflected the sophisticated nature of the fraud and the violation of family trust that made the crimes particularly egregious. Ms. Bennett, you systematically exploited your sister's love and trust over a period of many months. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a desperate response to an emergency situation. You planned and executed a complex fraud that caused significant harm to someone who had always supported you. That kind of calculated betrayal deserves substantial consequence. Victoria was also ordered to pay full restitution of $647,000, including interest and penalties, and to serve 5 years of supervised probation after her release. During probation, she would be prohibited from opening any financial accounts without court approval, and would be required to submit to regular financial monitoring. As the hearing concluded and Victoria was taken into custody, our parents approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. My mother was crying and my father looked like he'd aged 10 years since this whole ordeal began. Sarah, I know Victoria brought this on herself, but watching her get handcuffed and taken away, it's devastating. My mother said through tears, I understand. This isn't what any of us wanted. Is there any chance you two will ever be able to repair your relationship? She's still your sister, and family is all we really have in this world. It was a question I'd been asking myself throughout the entire legal process. Victoria and I shared 32 years of history that couldn't be erased by her crimes. We'd grown up together, supported each other through countless challenges, and built a relationship that had once been the most important thing in both our lives. But I also knew that trust, once broken this completely, was almost impossible to rebuild. Victoria hadn't just lied to me or made a mistake. She'd systematically exploited our relationship while actively working to hide her deception. Even if she served her sentence and made full restitution, how could I ever trust her again? I don't know, Mom. Maybe someday, but not anytime soon. Victoria didn't just steal money from me. She stole my ability to believe that family relationships are sacred. That's not something that can be fixed with an apology and a prison sentence. In the months that followed Victoria's sentencing, I focused on rebuilding my business and my life. The criminal conviction had actually helped with some aspects of the recovery process, since it provided definitive proof that I had been a victim of fraud rather than a willing participant in questionable business practices. Most of the fraudulent accounts were eventually removed from my credit report, though the process took almost a year and required constant follow-up with banks and credit agents. Several of Victoria's business partners and clients apologized for their initial skepticism about my claims, acknowledging that they should have been more suspicious of Victoria's too-good-to-be-true business credentials. I also received an unexpected call from Robert Chang, the property developer who had been angry with me during the height of the legal proceedings. Ms. Chen, I owe you an apology. When this situation first came to light, I was focused on my own business losses and didn't fully appreciate that you were a victim of fraud rather than someone trying to escape business obligations. I hope you can understand that I was just trying to protect my investment. Chang went on to explain that Victoria's conviction had helped him recover some of his losses through insurance claims, and that his properties were now being managed by a legitimate company with proper credentials and funding. If it's any consolation, several people in the real estate community have told me that your handling of this situation actually enhanced your reputation. Standing up to fraud, even when it involved family, showed a level of integrity that's unfortunately rare in business. Comments like Chang's helped me understand that while Victoria's crimes had certainly damaged my business in the short term, my response to the situation had ultimately demonstrated my character and values in ways that would benefit me professionally over the long term. I also started attending a support group for victims of family financial abuse, which helped me process the emotional aspects of what had happened. Meeting other people who had been victimized by family members made me realize that Victoria's behavior, while devastating to me personally, followed patterns that were unfortunately common in cases of financial exploitation. One group member, an elderly man whose son had stolen his retirement savings, made a comment that particularly resonated with me. The hardest part isn't losing the money, it's losing the illusion that your family member actually loved you. When someone steals from you, especially someone close to you, it makes you realize that they never saw you as a person worth respecting. That's a much deeper loss than any financial damage. His words captured exactly what I'd been struggling to articulate about Victoria's betrayal. The financial losses were significant, but they could eventually be recovered. The emotional damage, the loss of trust, the destruction of my faith in family relationships, the realization that someone I'd loved unconditionally had seen me primarily as a resource to be exploited was much more profound and lasting. 2 years after Victoria's sentencing, I received a letter from her in prison. She had completed several rehabilitation programs and was scheduled for early release in 6 months due to good behavior. The letter was carefully written and seemed genuinely remorseful, acknowledging the full scope of what she had done and accepting complete responsibility for her choices. Sarah, I know that I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not writing this letter to request anything from you. I just want you to know that I spend every day thinking about what I did to you and to our family. The counseling I've received in prison has helped me understand that my actions weren't just financial crimes, they were attacks on the person who loved me most in the world. Victoria went on to describe the mental health treatment she'd received and the insights she'd gained about her own behavior patterns. She acknowledged that her sense of entitlement and her belief that rules didn't apply to her had been building for years before she committed fraud against me. I convinced myself that I was helping both of us, but I know now that I was just making excuses for behavior I knew was wrong. I stole from you because I thought I could get away with it, and because I'd never faced real consequences for treating people badly before. That's on me,
not on mental illness or family dynamics or any of the other excuses I tried to use. The letter concluded with Victoria promising to continue making restitution payments and to respect my decision about whether we would ever have a relationship again. I understand if you never want to see me or speak to me again. I destroyed something precious because I was selfish and dishonest, and I don't expect you to forgive that. But I want you to know that I'm committed to becoming someone who deserves forgiveness, even if I never receive it. Reading Victoria's letter was emotionally complicated. Part of me was moved by what seemed like genuine remorse and growth, but another part of me remained skeptical, remembering how convincingly Victoria had performed emotions throughout our entire relationship. I decided not to respond to the letter immediately, instead taking time to think about what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to have with Victoria going forward. Prison letters and rehabilitation programs were positive signs, but they didn't erase the fundamental reality that Victoria had systematically betrayed my trust while actively working to hide her deception. 6 months later, Victoria was released from prison and moved back to Portland to begin her probation period. She was prohibited from working in real estate during probation, so she took a job as a waitress at a small restaurant near the airport. According to my parents, she was living in a modest apartment and focusing on meeting her restitution obligations and probation requirements. Victoria made no attempt to contact me directly after her release, which I appreciated. The decision about whether to rebuild our relationship needed to be mine, made on my timeline without pressure or manipulation from her. A year after Victoria's release, I was surprised to receive a check in the mail for $5,000 with a simple note attached: restitution payment. Thank you for holding me accountable, Vay. The check was significant because it represented money Victoria had earned from her waitressing job rather than funds that had been ordered by the court. It suggested that she was taking personal responsibility for making amends rather than just fulfilling legal obligations. Over the following months, I received several more restitution payments along with brief, respectful notes. Victoria never asked for responses or pushed for contact, but she consistently demonstrated through her actions that she was committed to making financial amends for her crimes. 3 years after Victoria's release, my father suffered a heart attack and was hospitalized for several weeks. During his recovery, I found myself at the hospital at the same time as Victoria for the first time since her sentencing hearing. We spoke briefly and awkwardly in the waiting room, focusing entirely on our father's condition and avoiding any discussion of our own relationship. But I was struck by how different Victoria seemed: quieter, more thoughtful, less concerned with making an impression or controlling the conversation. When our father recovered fully and returned home, Victoria sent me a text message suggesting that we meet for coffee to discuss coordinating our support for our parents as they aged. The message was respectful and practical, focused on family logistics rather than emotional reconciliation. I agreed to meet, primarily because I realized that our parents shouldn't have to navigate medical emergencies and aging-related challenges while managing the awkwardness of having 2 daughters who couldn't be in the same room together. The coffee meeting was stilted and uncomfortable, but it was also productive. We developed practical arrangements for sharing elder care responsibilities, communicating about our parents' needs, and coordinating visits and support without forcing personal interaction between us. Victoria made no attempts to apologize again or to push for forgiveness during that meeting. She seemed to understand that our relationship, if it was going to exist at all, would need to be rebuilt slowly and on entirely new terms. Over the following year, we had several more practical conversations about family matters, and I gradually began to see signs that Victoria had genuinely changed in fundamental ways. She was working 2 jobs to accelerate her restitution payments, living modestly and avoiding the kind of flashy lifestyle that had characterized her pre-prison years, and consistently putting our parents' needs ahead of her own convenience. But most importantly, Victoria never pushed for more personal contact or emotional reconciliation. She seemed to understand that trust had to be earned through consistent actions over time, not through apologies or promises about future behavior. 4 years after Victoria's release, she made her final restitution payment, completing her financial obligations 2 years ahead of schedule. She sent me a simple message, acknowledging the milestone: final payment complete. Thank you for giving me the chance to make this right. By that point, our practical co-parenting of our elderly parents had evolved into something that almost resembled a functional sibling relationship, though one that was far more cautious and limited than what we'd shared before her crime. When our mother was diagnosed with early-stage dementia, Victoria and I worked together to research treatment options, coordinate medical appointments, and adapt our parents' living situation to accommodate new challenges. The cooperation was businesslike rather than warm, but it was effective and seemed to benefit our parents tremendously. During one particularly difficult medical appointment, Victoria made a comment that helped me understand how much she had actually changed. "Sarah, I know that working together like this probably isn't easy for you, given everything I put you through. If it would be better for Mom and Dad if I stepped back and let you handle their care alone, I'll do that. I don't want my presence to make things harder for anyone." The offer was genuine and selfless in a way that the old Victoria never would have managed. The sister who had stolen my identity and then tried to manipulate me into accepting her crimes would never have voluntarily stepped aside for someone else's benefit. I realized in that moment that while Victoria and I would never return to the close, trusting relationship we'd once shared, we had developed something new, a functional partnership based on mutual respect and shared responsibilities rather than emotional intimacy and unconditional trust. It wasn't the relationship I'd once dreamed of having with my sister, but it was honest and sustainable in ways that our previous dynamic had never been. Victoria had learned to respect boundaries, accept consequences, and prioritize other people's needs over her own convenience. I had learned to protect myself while still engaging with family responsibility. Looking back on the entire experience now, I understand that Victoria's crimes, while devastating at the time, ultimately forced both of us to develop healthier patterns of relating to each other and to family obligation. The old dynamic, where I enabled Victoria's irresponsible behavior and she exploited my unconditional support, had been unsustainable and ultimately harmful to both of us. The criminal justice process, painful as it was, had provided the external structure necessary to break those destructive patterns and force us both to develop more mature approaches to family relationships. Victoria had learned that actions have consequences, and that family relationships require mutual respect rather than one-sided exploitation. I had learned that love without boundaries isn't actually love, it's enabling that ultimately hurts everyone involved. The phrase that had started this entire ordeal, "stay out of their business," had taken on new meaning over the years. Victoria had initially used it to dismiss my concerns about her fraudulent activities and to justify excluding me from decisions that directly affected my life. But I had ultimately stayed out of her business in the most powerful way possible by refusing to enable her criminal behavior and allowing her to face the full consequences of her choices. By stepping back and letting the legal system hold Victoria accountable rather than trying to protect her from the results of her actions, I had given her the opportunity to develop genuine accountability and personal growth. It was the most loving thing I could have done, even though it hadn't felt loving at the time. Today, Victoria runs a small accounting firm that specializes in helping ex-offenders rebuild their financial lives. She's used her experience with fraud and financial crimes to develop expertise in legitimate financial planning and business development. Her clients appreciate working with someone who understands the challenges of rebuilding after making serious mistakes. I still run Chen Digital Solutions, which has grown significantly since the fraud incident. My reputation for integrity and accountability, demonstrated during the most difficult period of my life, has attracted clients who value working with someone they can trust completely. The business that Victoria tried to steal has become more successful than it ever was before her crimes. Our relationship remains cordial and functional rather than warm and intimate, but it's built on a foundation of genuine respect and mutual responsibility that didn't exist before. We'll never be the close sisters we once were, but we've become something perhaps more valuable, two adults who can work together effectively while maintaining appropriate boundaries and realistic expectations. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that real love sometimes requires allowing the people we care about to face consequences for their actions. Protecting Victoria from accountability wouldn't have helped her grow or change, it would have just enabled her to continue hurting herself and others. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for someone is to step out of their business entirely and let them learn from their own choice. And sometimes, the most powerful response to being told to stay out of their business is to stay out of sharing your business with them completely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.